January 13th, 2026. A Canadian government plane touches down in Beijing. No fanfare. No army of corporate executives filling the seats. No wall-to-wall media coverage on American cable news. Just a prime minister with a purpose, a team that had prepared for months, and a very specific list of things that needed to happen inside that building. 4 months later, the President of the United States flew to the same city. Same airport, same building, same leader on the other side of the table. But the difference between those two arrivals is not just a matter of timing. It is a matter of who holds the leverage, who set the terms, and who is still trying to catch up. And the man who is still trying to catch up is the one who called the other one's trip a betrayal. That is this story. The story of how Canada got to Beijing first, secured something real, and then watched Washington punish Ottawa for it, before Washington turned around and made the exact same journey for the exact same reasons. And the facts of what happened between January and May do not flatter the most powerful country on earth. Let us start with what actually happened in January, because most coverage skipped over it entirely. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, landed in Beijing on January 13th, 2026. It was the first visit by a Canadian leader to China since 2017, 9 years of diplomatic distance that Carney chose to close with a clear agenda and no apology. He met President Xi Jinping. He met Premier Li Keqiang. He met Zhao Leiji, the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. He worked through every level of China's leadership with the kind of methodical patience that tends to produce results. And it produced results. The two countries released a joint statement establishing a new Canada-China strategic partnership. China agreed to cut its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from a combined rate of approximately 85% down to around 15%. That single move affected a market worth roughly $4 billion for Canadian farmers. Canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and Canadian peas were removed from China's anti-discrimination tariff list entirely. According to Canada's Prime Minister's office, the full package of agreements unlocked close to $3 billion in export orders for Canadian workers and businesses. The deal also included a clean energy partnership recognizing both countries as energy superpowers, commitments on climate cooperation, visa-free travel access for Canadians visiting China, and Chinese support for Canada's bid to host the 2029 APEC summit. $3 billion, no corporate parade, no Middle East war as backdrop, no record low approval ratings driving the urgency. Carney came with a specific brief and left with something specific. That is the baseline against which everything else in this story has to be measured. Now here's the part that changes everything. While Carney was in Beijing building this arrangement, Trump was doing something else entirely. He was threatening anyone who tried. In the days after Canada's Beijing visit became public, Trump took to Truth Social. He wrote that if Governor Carney, deliberately demoting a sitting prime minister to governor in his own post, thought he was going to make Canada a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States, he was sorely mistaken. He threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian exports if Ottawa made any deal with Beijing. Then, in late January, when Carney stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos and warned the world about economic coercion by powerful states, Trump escalated. He wrote directly about Canada. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. He then pulled Canada's invitation to his so-called Board of Peace, the American International Forum he had been advertising since the beginning of the year. Canada had been building a new trade channel, and Canada was punished for it. Those are the facts. Now hold that sequence in your mind and look at what happened in May. On May 13th, 2026, Donald Trump boarded Air Force One and flew to Beijing. He arrived with Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, who attended despite a very public falling out with Trump just last year. Tim Cook of Apple was there on what has been described as one of his final major diplomatic appearances before his expected retirement in September. Jensen Huang of Nvidia was added to the delegation at the last moment. Larry Fink of BlackRock came representing an institution that manages roughly $11 trillion in assets. David Solomon of Goldman Sachs was there, Kelly Ortberg of Boeing. Representatives from Citigroup, MasterCard, Cargill, Blackstone, Micron, Qualcomm, and GE Aerospace rounded out the broader commercial presence. When an American president carries that roster to a foreign capital, the message is not subtle and it is not strategic in the traditional sense. It is a price list. Open your market and we will buy things from you. Buy our aircraft and we will ease the pressure. Take our agricultural goods and we will soften our language on certain disputes. Help us on Iran and we will rethink parts of our containment posture. That is what a delegation of this composition says to the country receiving it. It says we need this more than we are letting on in the press conference. And there is a reason Trump needed it more than he was letting on. This summit was supposed to happen in March. It was delayed because the United States and Israel launched a military campaign against Iran on February 28, 2026. The Trump administration's public estimate was that the operation would last 4 to 6 weeks. It is now mid-May. The war is still active. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy corridors, remains under a dual blockade. The blockade has driven global oil prices sharply higher. Inside the United States, gasoline prices have risen enough to land directly on voters' kitchen tables. Trump's approval rating has fallen into record low territory as a result. The midterm elections are now less than 6 months away. So when Air Force One lifted off on May 12th, it was not carrying a president who had solved his problems and was now extending American influence from a position of strength. It was carrying a president who had not solved his problems and was flying across the Pacific to ask whether Beijing might help him solve some of them. The summit agenda makes this visible. Trade volumes, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, the Iran situation, rare earth export controls, semiconductor restrictions, Boeing aircraft orders, soybean and beef purchases, the case of Jimmy Lai, the jailed Hong Kong publisher. Nearly every unresolved dispute between Washington and Beijing was compressed into a 48-hour visit. The Council on Foreign Relations described the meeting, before it even began, as an effort to stabilize the relationship, not to resolve its disputes. Kyle Chan of the Brookings Institution put it more plainly. Both sides want stability, both sides want to reconfirm the relationship, and nobody is expecting major deliverables. Nobody. For the largest American corporate delegation to China in a generation. And here is where the story becomes something that no amount of official ceremony can paper over. 4 months ago, Trump called Canada's engagement with Beijing a threat to Western economic security. He threatened Canadian exports. He personally mocked Canada's prime minister in public. He withdrew a diplomatic invitation as punishment. His argument, stated plainly, was that making deals with China is something America's allies should not do. Then Trump made the same trip. With a bigger delegation, seeking the same market access, asking for the same tariff relief on American goods, hoping for the same diplomatic signal on a regional conflict. The only difference is the flag on the aircraft and the scale of the corporate entourage. Either engaging China is a problem, in which case Trump's own summit is a problem, or engaging China is acceptable diplomacy, in which case Canada's January visit was acceptable diplomacy and the threats against Carney had no legitimate foundation. There is no version of events where both things are true at once. Washington has applied one standard to itself and a different standard to one of its closest allies, and the facts of the timeline make that impossible to argue around. Beijing is reading this with full clarity. Chinese state media spent the week before Trump's arrival reminding global audiences that Iran's foreign minister had visited Beijing just 1 week prior. It reminded the world that Russian President Putin was scheduled to arrive in the Chinese capital within days of Trump's departure. That scheduling is not accidental. Beijing is not presenting these visits as separate events. It is presenting itself as a gravitational center of global diplomacy, a place where the world's most consequential conversations happen on Beijing's calendar and at Beijing's pace. The American president is one visitor among several. Russia follows him, Iran preceded him, and Canada got there 4 months before any of them. The rest of the world has been watching and drawing conclusions that are going to outlast this summit by years. Japan and South Korea have seen American military assets shift toward the Middle East during the Iran campaign, visibly reducing Washington's presence in the Pacific at a moment of ongoing regional tension. Germany and France have watched an American-led military operation continue far beyond every timeline the administration provided to its allies. India has continued purchasing Russian oil despite direct American pressure. Australia has quietly rebuilt its wine and barley trade with China following years of tension. And Canada, America's closest ally on Earth, the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world and the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world, has now formally opened a new strategic channel with Beijing and refused to close it when Washington threatened consequences. The assumption that held Western foreign policy together for 30 years, that no close American ally would make a separate strategic arrangement with China without Washington's approval, is no longer the operating assumption. It broke in January, and it broke not because Canada was looking to challenge American leadership. It broke because Ottawa looked at the direction of the global economy and made a pragmatic decision about where Canadian interests lie. That decision is now producing results. The threats that were supposed to prevent it have produced none. There is one dimension of this week's summit that demands special attention because the stakes are significantly higher than a soybean order: Taiwan. Trump signaled before arriving in Beijing that he intended to raise Taiwan in his conversations with Xi. He suggested this might include discussion of American arms sales to Taipei. Analysts in Washington and Taipei warned publicly in the days before the summit that any improvised statement, any departure from America's long-standing policy of deliberate ambiguity on Taiwan's status, could give Beijing a diplomatic opening that decades of careful positioning were designed to prevent. The concern is not theoretical. One carelessly phrased sentence in a bilateral meeting with the Chinese president, spoken by a leader known for going off script, could alter the diplomatic architecture around Taiwan in ways that take a generation to repair. Carney did not go near that fault line in January. He understood that Canada's mandate in Beijing was trade, clean energy, and agricultural exports. He stayed within that brief. He created no new complications. He left no headlines the next morning about a diplomatic misstep. He produced $3 billion in motion and flew home. That comparison is not a small thing. Knowing what not to say and choosing to stay within a clear brief rather than importing problems that have nothing to do with the task at hand is itself a form of leadership. One leader demonstrated it in January. The other arrived in May with a Taiwan conversation on the agenda and a known tendency to improvise. Now look at what comes after, because the summit's aftermath is where the story resolves. If Trump returns from Beijing with real deliverables, Boeing orders he can announce, soybean purchases he can post about, a signal from Xi on Iran that he can present as a diplomatic breakthrough, he will face a problem he cannot spin his way out of. He punished Canada for getting the same access. He will have made his own argument incoherent. His tariff threats against Ottawa will stand exposed as not a principled position about China engagement, but a political reaction to a smaller country doing something effective before he did. And if Trump returns without real deliverables, if the summit produces language about dialogue and mutual respect without numbers, without purchases, without agreements that move money, then Mark Carney's 4-month lead becomes the defining diplomatic story of the year. A Canadian Prime Minister arrived first, worked methodically, secured $3 billion in concrete outcomes, absorbed Washington's anger without reversing course, and watched the American president make the same trip months later with nothing to show for the size of his delegation. Either outcome points to the same conclusion. Ottawa read the moment correctly. Washington is still trying to catch up. The next major chapter in this story comes later this year. Carney has already confirmed he will attend the APEC Leaders Summit in China. He will return to Beijing. He will walk into the same rooms Trump is using this week. He will sit across from the same Xi Jinping. But he will not arrive as a leader building a relationship from scratch. He will arrive as the prime minister who was there first, who secured something concrete while being publicly threatened by the most powerful leader in the world, who held his ground and who now returns with a track record that speaks for itself. That is a different kind of standing than anything being constructed in Beijing this week by the largest corporate delegation in the modern history of American presidential travel. The larger story here is not really about one summit. It is about who understood the new shape of global power early enough to act on it, and who understood it only after the consequences of inaction became politically unavoidable. Canada understood it in January. The deals are moving. The partnership is recorded in a joint statement. Canadian farmers are selling canola at 15% tariffs instead of 85%. Washington understood it in May. The delegation is impressive. The ceremony is elaborate. The outcome is uncertain. History does not particularly reward the country that shows up with the biggest corporate jet. It rewards the country that shows up with a clear brief, a prepared team, and the patience to stay within its lane long enough to produce something real. Mark Carney showed up in January with exactly that. The world noticed, even if Washington chose not to. If this is a story you have not heard framed this way before, share it. And leave your thoughts below, because the conversation around what is really happening between Washington, Ottawa, and Beijing is just getting started.